They want solutions, and they want government to work for them. They simply want to know when a problem like load shedding will be brought to an end. We are therefore focused on those actions that will make a meaningful difference now and will enable real progress within the next year, and that we lay a foundation for a sustained recovery into the future.
With President Cyril Ramaphosa delivering his State of the Nation address on Thursday, some hope that his speech will focus more on the improvement of the economy and the lives of ordinary people in South Africa. Good evening, welcome to Unfiltered. I'm Sizwe Mpofu Walsh. With the general election approaching, Ramaphosa is likely to succumb to the temptation of making populist promises to South Africans. So tonight we ask, will the State of the Nation address meet South Africans' expectations? And to help us preview the State of the Nation address, we're joined by analysts Duma Qubule and Bongani Mahlangu. Mr. Qubule, thank you very much for joining us. You keep a very close eye on South Africa's economy, and I'd like to start right there with the State of the Nation address, and particularly the question of unemployment, which is one of your areas of expertise. How do we assess what has happened with unemployment over the last year, and what are you expecting from the President on that subject?
Thank you, Sizwe. Over the past year, since the start of the pandemic, I was part of the campaign for a basic income grant. And we've run a very good campaign. It's the most researched topic in South Africa, I think, since 1994. But my main focus is jobs. I think South Africans are not understanding the scale of the unemployment crisis. We have 11.7 million unemployed people in South Africa. We've got the people must understand the maths of the unemployment crisis. So, for example, there's a demand side and then there's the supply side. So, if we take from quarter 4 2008 until quarter 3 2023, the labor force increased by 7.8 million people, but the economy only created 2 million jobs. So then the number of unemployed people increased by 5.8%, and the unemployment rate went from 28.7 to 41.2. So that is the basic maths of the unemployment crisis. So you have, on the supply side, the labor force growth rate. I use what you call a labor force growth rate to forecast until 2035 of about 2.4%, is slightly below the pre-COVID average. So we're going to have about 800,000 people entering the labor force every year until 2035, based on that labor force growth rate. And then there's the demand side. It's about, there's something called, it's a GDP growth rate and the employment multiplier. So I calculated an employment multiplier. It's the relationship between growth and employment. So 0.9 times over the past 2 decades. I'm simplifying something. And I stripped out the periods where we had fundamental dislocation of our labor market in the global financial crisis and during COVID. So it's 0.9. So based on those numbers, the 2.4% growth and the 0.9, we need a 4.2% GDP growth rate just to create jobs for the annual entrance into the labor force.
So just to clarify this, just for the number of people who are basically coming into the labor force, we need 4.2% economic growth just to meet that number that's
just
coming in.
Just to meet that number,
go beyond that. And
not to go beyond that. So we will still have, let alone the 11.7. So if let's say we go on that path, there will still be 11.7 million unemployed people by 2035, So that is the scale of the crisis. So now, if we have 6% GDP growth rate, we can eat into the number of people unemployed. Now, the core of this unemployment crisis, the NDP sets a target of 5.4% GDP growth, and it sets a target for 11 million jobs by 2030. But nobody is responsible for achieving that target. So the Reserve Bank says we only care about inflation. National Treasury says we only care about debt. Some South Africans believe it's Thulas Nxesi's job. It's not Thulas Nxesi's job, the Minister of Labour. He doesn't have the tools to address the unemployment crisis. He's just got a few of them. So what I'm trying to say is that I've been saying to all the political parties. I've been seeing some. If you look, there was a survey that was done that Change Starts Now. They said that 75% of voters said unemployment is the number one issue. 21% said it's the the cost of living. So I think if you're not giving, as a political party, a credible path towards full employment with binding GDP targets for the Reserve Bank and National Treasury, you're wasting our time. Because I think we've gone beyond the situation of having these platitudes. And so just to quickly, I just think that there's three levers to get this unemployment under control.
Well, let me bring in Mr. Mahlangu, and we have a long show tonight, so we'll definitely come back into that. Mr. Mahlangu, thank you very much for joining us just on this issue of jobs, because this is really front and center of the economy in South Africa. This is a crisis that's been with us for a very long time. It's a crisis that President Ramaphosa will no doubt have to say something about in his Sona. What's your assessment on where we are in terms of unemployment, some of the Sona promises that have been made, and what do you think President Ramaphosa needs to do on Thursday night on this key issue? I believe you're on mute, Mr. Mahlangu.
Yeah. No, thanks for the invitation. Greetings to you guys and also the viewers at home. So I think it's first important to acknowledge that this is a Sona of an election year. This is a Sona of the end of the midterm strategic framework from 2019 to 2024. We are not too far off from the maturity of the NDP, and this is a Sona that marks 30 years into our democracy. So then when we look into what was pronounced in the yesteryear, the president promised a big number of jobs. I think there were around about 1.7 million. And if you look into the initiatives that were taken then, such as the presidential employment stimulus, in the main that contributed a lot of jobs there was the presidential youth employment initiatives, which I think 1.1 million of those people there were general assistants at schools. So those numbers may look big, but they're not something to applaud because it's generally underemployment. Because oftentimes when we talk about employment, we just juxtapose employment and unemployment. And we forget that a lot of South Africans are actually underemployed, meaning those that have studied are not working. The jobs that they would have studied for, people are underpaid. You also find issues of employment filtering. What do I mean by that? If you look at retailers or retail banks, a couple of years back, they would employ someone with a matric. This year or currently they employ someone with a degree. We see it also in the SABC from their 10,000 cohorts that were recently recruited and joined the force. Most of them are people that have a degree. And if you look at a couple of years back, you'd only need a matric and a driver's license. So that is employment filtering. So because of high unemployment, those that have the highest qualifications are squeezing those with lesser qualifications or no qualifications out of the labor market, yet they themselves are still underemployed. So often we don't analyze that as well. So as any other year when it comes to employment, because it is a topical issue, worse off this year because it's also part of an election or a campaign strategy, we're expecting big promises. But I also wanted to touch on what was said earlier, that no one is responsible. So basically how it works with regards to planning in the public sector is that when it is there in the NDP, those targets must then find expression in the midterm strategic framework, which then would guide the growth and development strategy, more especially for your provincial departments and also your municipalities that have a GDS. And then that should also find expression in the strategic plans, and then that would find expression in the annual performance plan if it's a provincial department. If it is a municipality, it should find expression in the IDP and SDPIP. So the problem is that there is no monitoring. So even not just on jobs, but on anything. So the president will come this week or this month, make pronouncements, and those pronouncements end in those chambers. And what should happen is that those pronouncements must find expression in the guiding or planning documents, and then there will be monitoring and evaluation to check as to what was the impact, what was done, what does output and input. So we are not getting that. So any other year we'll get big numbers being thrown around, but I can guarantee you it's mainly underemployment initiatives.
Right. Let me put some of that back to Mr. Kubule and just to pick up on a few things. Firstly, I think it's also important how Mr. Mahlangu situates the Sona 30 years of democracy, the end of, we're getting to 2030, which used to be a very far off date and is suddenly fast approaching. It's also the last Sona of President Ramaphosa's presidential term. We go into an election very soon after this Sona. And so he doesn't actually have a lot of runway to promise, because we don't know what kind of government is coming after this. So, you know, of course, you feel free to respond in any way to Mr. Mahlangu's points, but I also wonder, what do you think he should say on the economy in this Sona? What would you welcome?
You know, Sizwe, unless there's a credible path towards full employment, I think everybody's wasting our time, whether you're the president or you're the opposition parties. So the first thing I want to say in response to Mr. Mahlangu, Mr. Mahlangu, unemployment is a macroeconomic policy issue, end of story. So the policy tools to address it sit with the Reserve Bank and National Treasury, nobody else. And they have to stimulate the growth through spending decisions and all this. So we need to get that GDP growth rate higher. That's number one. Number two, the second lever to address this thing is your industrial policies. So our annual spending on industrial policies is about 0.3% of GDP, which is insignificant. And the policy tools are very few. You know, by comparison, there's one economist I talked to from China, and she was telling me that in China they've got 1,800 government guidance funds. So when they set up they're going to focus on EVs. There's a fund to support the electric vehicles. When they're going to focus on artificial intelligence, there's within the components of, their Made in China strategy, they have funds for each of those things. But we don't have the policy tools to transform the structure of the economy. And quite frankly, there is no we've got about 10 master plans, and we've got, they employ about 12% of the population. But that is not about transforming the whole economy. So that's the second lever. We need to increase that employment multiplier by changing the structure of the economy. The third one is public employment, what Mr. Mahlangu was talking about. We've got 3 public employment programs. There's the Presidential Employment Stimulus. We've got the Community Public Works Program. We've also got the Expanded Public Works Program. So according to my calculations, these things create 1.8 million full-time equivalent, 1.8 million work opportunities and 900,000 full-time equivalent jobs. We should have none of the political parties that have come out with their manifestos say anything about public employment, because even if the government does everything I say they must do on unemployment, the GDP growth, the Reserve Bank, the industrial policy, many people will still be unemployed. So I think what South Africans should understand is that there's no one policy that's going to get rid of this unemployment crisis. We have to do everything it takes. We have to throw the kitchen sink at the problem. Right. So the other one, we need a target for public employment. Anything less than 5 million work opportunities and 3 million full-time equivalent jobs, I think is inadequate. Yeah.
Absolutely. Let's leave it there. We're going to cut to our first break. When we come back, we'll continue this debate and discussion about what President Ramaphosa needs to focus on in terms of his Sona on the economy. And we'll also turn our attention to energy. Of course, load shedding is prime and paramount on South Africans' minds. Let's go to a break and we'll be back straight after that.
Load shedding, unemployment, poverty and rising cost of living, crime and corruption. I must say, honorable members, there are no easy solutions to any of these challenges. Yet we have the strength, the means and the wherewithal, yes, to overcome them.
That was President Ramaphosa in his Sona from last year. And of course, on Thursday, President Ramaphosa delivers his State of the Nation address. And this will be the last of this presidential term. This evening, we're looking at Sona's past, what is to come, and what the president needs to do to reassure South Africans that they can go into the future with hope. Mr. Mahlangu, thanks very much. Of course, we were talking about unemployment. I'd also like to move on to the question of energy security, because this was really a central pillar of President Ramaphosa's Sona last year. In fact, I was going back and listening to it, and he announced the Minister of Electricity in the Sona from 2023. Now, 2023 was the worst year for load shedding in South Africa, but some argue that we're starting to see green shoots of progress. What are your thoughts on the question of energy and, you know, this debilitating problem of load shedding and the promises that were made last year?
All right, no, thanks. So if we start with the promises that were made last year, we find that the first one was the promise of the Minister of Energy. So that was done, but then it was not done in full in the context that when it comes to the delegation of power for this minister to actually do something worth noting, it has been a problem. He's given powers, I think, every 6 months or so. And even now, they are heading towards the end of the sixth administration, where he still doesn't have full powers or adequate powers to actually execute anything of significance. There was also then the promise of an addition of new generation capacity. So that has came in drips and drabs, and that is why load shedding is still being experienced since the statement was made last year. And even when the financial year began in April for government, there was still continuation. And when the financial year came, we should have seen implementation. And then where we are right now, we should be comparing from the last Sona to now, the year-on-year comparisons as to what improvements are there. And the load shedding still persists. In fact, is now what worsens load shedding, or a more bigger threat to the economy, the logistical issue of Transnet. And then also there was about the improvement of existing capacity or existing plants that are there to, in terms of energy generation. So we've seen also little improvement when it comes to the improvement of existing infrastructure in energy generation and distribution. And we can even go maybe as far as transmission itself. Then there was also speak of the rollout of renewable power and new transmission lines. So we know that as well has been insignificant, and also the bounce back loan scheme for SMMEs to invest in solar equipment, that has also been insignificant, because the most important thing about Sona is that it's done on an annual basis. So it's important to always do a year-to-year comparisons. So from everything that the president spoke about last year, comparing it then to where we are now, the most significant one, or the one that was achieved in part, was actually the appointment of the board. It was appointment of the minister, but the board itself has had problems where the chairperson had to leave, and there were also issues there in terms of the executive of Eskom. There were issues there in terms of the 400 billion rand debt of Eskom. There were issues there. Right. So we can say that if it was a report card, he didn't do well on that one as well.
Mr. Kubule, what are your thoughts on this energy crisis and the promises that have been made from the last Sona to now?
Okay, so we've got twin crises, as Mr. Mahlangu said. So it's the Eskom crisis and the Transnet crisis. Now, what the parties are making a mistake, some of the opposition parties, is that they're saying that we must just sort out these two issues and we're going to go to 6% growth. And that is not true, because the problems of Eskom plants collapsing started in 2018 when President Ramaphosa was appointed, not 2007. There's this myth that we had this, consecutive years of load shedding under Jacob Zuma from 2007. However, for 7 out of 9 years, there was no load shedding whatsoever. There was only 8 months from 2014 to 2015 when those load shedding because of one specific issue. So if you look at what happened, we had the Energy Action Plan in July 2022, the appointment of the minister, 2023 that was announced. But 2023, after Andre de Ruyter leaves, it was the worst year in load shedding history, as you say. The energy that was shed last year was it was much more than all the previous years from 2017 to 2022 combined. It accounted for 50% of the energy that was shed since 2007. Number two, since 2018, under the Ramaphosa presidency, it accounts for 95% of the energy that was shed since 2007. So this is entirely something that has happened in the last 6 years in terms of yeah. And then the final one is that under Zuma, it was 3.4% load shedding, yeah. And so what I'm trying to say is that with this energy crisis, we must understand the scale of this crisis. And what was announced is the structural reforms. Now, basically, to cut a long story short, bid window 5 is kind of collapsed, and bid window 6, they're in serious trouble. And we've got about 2,300 megawatts, or I think it's 2,300 megawatts that's under construction. And there was the one before, the Risk Mitigation Independent Power Producer Program, and there's embedded generation. But if you add up all these initiatives, they add up to very little in terms of money on the ground, because we have an investment crisis in this economy. Public investment has collapsed since 2015 to 2022 by 38% because of these insane austerity policies of the government. What logic is there in stopping to invest in your country? Because South Africa, you drive around everywhere, it is falling apart because the government is not investing in its economy. So this structural reform, it's called for privatization, deregulation, and liberalization, and the state withdrawal from these network industries. So the state withdraws from these industries, and the private sector is supposed to be our savior. But as you can see from what I'm saying, there is very little that is coming from the private sector side in terms of this renewable energy. It is not enough to sort out this crisis. I personally am one of the people who believe in the public option for renewables. I think that's what we just do, and I believe that the debt relief that was provided to Eskom is inadequate. I believe in a public option. That is the quickest way to achieve this transition to green. It's because you're not at the mercy of these private investors who threaten to investment strike every time there's something they don't want. Yeah.
Right, absolutely. I mean, in President Ramaphosa's defense, and you've both painted a very alarming picture of just what South Africans have been through last year in terms of load shedding. And I mean, one doesn't need to paint the picture because we've all experienced it in many ways. He would argue, and I suspect he will argue in the Sona, Mr. Mahlangu, that yes, tough times, tough year, but things are beginning to turn. We're beginning to see the ship turning around. Since the Minister of Electricity's appointment, no more stage 6 at least. Stage 1, sometimes we get a reprieve to a few days without load shedding, and we're heading in the right direction. Do you think that assessment is correct, and that we've seen the worst of this crisis?
He might argue and even give statistics, but then when you go to the ground, and that is your SMMEs or your production sector, I think the economist there even puts it well, that when we look into the investment of gross capital formation over the years, it has been on a downward trend. So, but he would also obviously rebut and say that there have been improvements here and there. But when we then go to the ground, there's this thing called desired pathway. And this desired pathway is also used in assessment of interventions or the work of government. So government, in its own reports, there will always be something that it's doing, and it would applaud itself on what it's doing. But then on the ground, are they assessing them the same way with regards to performance? Then it becomes no. Because if we are saying 2023 was the worst year ever, and we have seen years when there's a Rugby World Cup or in December, load shedding would be suspended. But that is not permanent. So in the long run, we still have it, and it's still affecting the productive capacity of this country. And it's also affecting people socially as well. And people are complaining about it, and they're still making noise about it. So then how Ramaphosa and the sixth administration would appraise themselves and how they would be appraised on the ground, there would be two appraisal systems there, and that is not good for them. So it is important that as and when you make initiatives, they are so tangible, they are so significant that it actually makes impact on the ground. So then how you appraise yourself and how the ground appraises you, there is some form of consistency there, and there's no consistency. Hence, a lot of people are angry. Hence, a lot of people are even saying that going into these elections, they might vote otherwise solely because of that. So, yeah, so he will say what he has to say to defend himself politically. but then that is not the sentiment from the lived experience of the people of South Africa.
Indeed, we're going to continue this conversation, previewing the State of the Nation address. As citizens, it's important for us not only to watch the speech, appraise it, but go back to previous addresses, see which promises have been kept and which have been broken, and that's exactly what we're doing tonight. We've looked at the economy, we've looked at load shedding, and when we come back from the break, we'll look at some other questions such as the state's capacity to deal with corruption as well as education. Stick with us as we preview Sona 2024. Welcome back to Unfiltered. President Cyril Ramaphosa will deliver the all-important State of the Nation Address 2024 on Thursday. And in tonight's show, we are previewing that Sona with some of our country's most incisive minds on our economy and indeed our political landscape. Now, we've spoken about the economy, we've spoken about load shedding, which are obviously top of mind, but there are many other issues that President Ramaphosa has addressed in previous Sonas. Now, one of them may not seem like an economic issue, but it has economic implications, and that is this plank of President Cyril Ramaphosa's presidency, which has been the fight against corruption. He rose to prominence, rose to power on promises of dealing decisively with corruption, of turning the problem of corruption around. Mr. Qubule, how do you assess what has been done in terms of building a more capable and ethical state, and its bearing, of course, on the economy ultimately?
Well, you know, there was state capture, there was a new board at Transnet, at Eskom and at Transnet, and we thought that things are going to get better. They just got worse, you know, and so I'm not sure what we've done with the capacity of our state-owned companies. One after the other, they've collapsed. South African Airways, Mango, you name them all. So it's a graveyard in terms of the situation with state-owned companies. And quite frankly, my view on this one, on the state-owned companies, is that we need to take off the debt at Transnet off its balance sheet. It's 130 billion rands. They're paying 10 billion rands a year in terms of interest, 10 billion rands a month. And we need to take off the entire debt off the Eskom balance sheet to create the financial runway for them to make the investments that they need to get this. So in terms of state capacity, in terms of the state-owned companies, there is no solution to it without giving proper financial relief to these companies. And obviously, you know, developing mechanisms for them to happen. Now, in terms of the state proper, you know, Sizwe, hey, this one is just, maybe it's above my pay grade, you know. But the thing is that, you know, when I start arguing that we need a stimulus for this economy, people say, no, but not this ANC government, you know. So I'm just saying that in terms of state capacity, we need to innovate as well, because the state is not in a situation, you know, I was talking to, what's it called, the DDG of National Health recently, and he was talking about all these corruption cases in the skinny jeans at Tembisa and all this. But the point is, we need to create some new institutions. We need to innovate. Can we bypass the state temporarily and create a new kind of, you know, a quasi-public institution, like I talked about for the jobs, where we amalgamate the 3 public employment programs, and we have civil society oversight, professional management, something like the Solidarity Fund that we had recently for the COVID response. Nothing happened there that was, you know, untoward, and it had professional management, it had civil society oversight. Maybe it wasn't enough with the Solidarity Fund, but I just think that, you know, after the Great Depression in the US in the 30s, Roosevelt started these things called alphabet agencies, which was a whole range of agencies to start rebuilding the US after the Great Depression. And that is the situation we're in today. If the state can't get it, so I believe that if there's proper oversight over government spending, transparency in terms of technology, and civil society watchdogs, you know, watching exactly what happens, we shouldn't have a situation whereby you have to wait 5 years for the public protector report after the event. There should be some system of real-time monitoring, you know, what is happening in terms of all the major projects in the country. Yeah.
Indeed. Mr. Mahlangu, what are your thoughts on what Mr. Qubule has said, and indeed this deeper theme of President Cyril Ramaphosa's presidency? I think all of his Sona addresses have touched on this issue of trying to turn around the ship of state, make it more capable, more ethical, and overcome the rot of what he calls the state capture years?
All right, no, thanks. As I said, again, we'll have to do a year-on-year comparison. So you would remember that in the last Sona, what was promised was a professionalization of the public sector. So from what we see, little has been done in that space as well. We saw what was promised again was addressing the failures at local government. So from the 256 odd municipalities, we still know that most of them are not doing well, and even some that used to do well are beginning to struggle now, administratively, structurally, and systematically. Also, it was a promise of rationalization of the government. So that was defined as minimizing the ministries, trying to get a lean structure, more efficient, more effective, more economical, but in fact the inverse then took place. So then from what was promised till now, the opposite mainly took place. And it's also important that when we look into even corruption in the public sector, we do not always reduce it to politicians, because if you know, as much as politicians can exert some kind of pressure, more especially when it comes to the supply chain processes of a public entity. But I think the most problematic individuals are actually the officials, administrators, because they press the buttons, they constitute your SCM committees, they do the bid specifications, evaluations, adjudications, the entire value chain of that. So they are the most problematic people. So what was promised was that there would be lifestyle audits of such individuals, and we've hardly seen any. The only thing that they do is these voluntarily declarations in terms of how they are living and what assets they have and so forth. So we haven't seen people being arrested, we haven't seen people being disciplined, we haven't been seeing people being fired and so forth and so on. And that's across the board, national, provincial, local, and also state-owned entities. So it is inconsistent to what was promised. But I do believe that if the sixth administration were to do something, even though they have a couple of months left in office, I'm telling you, we would see positive results, more especially when it comes to service delivery. Because you would also look at how government usually reports. They would report in numbers. We spent 30 billion here, 50 billion there, but they would not tell us what has been the impact of that 30 billion, the impact of that 50 billion, because most of it goes to the pockets of these officials, administrators, and whoever they want to give business to. So we still push for building state capacity. That is critical. We still push for professionalization of the public service. We still push for stabilization of local government. And even if we look at maybe, for instance, in terms of the economics of it, local government has a responsibility towards local economic development. They must ensure development, economics, and economic development. But if you look into most of the local economic development units of these these local governments, they are dysfunctional, they are understaffed, undercapacitated, so they have a lot of problems. So they are not contributing towards the national objective in terms of growing the economy, creating jobs. So a lot needs to be done.
Let me ask this question, because I think it's easy to maybe get lost in doom and gloom. And in the present, it always feels as if things are worse, and we can often look back and reassess and realize that in fact important gains have been made. What do you think has been a success of either the last year or the Ramaphosa presidency, and what actually has been achieved? Because as difficult as load shedding has been, as tough as the economic position has been, it is important to also reflect on the gains and the progress made.
I think one of the successes was the presidential employment stimulus.
Sure.
And I was horrified that National Treasury wanted to cancel something that works. And there was a campaign by some civil society organizations like Youth Capital for this thing to continue. So what I'm trying to say is that let's build on the success of this presidential employment stimulus. It was centralized in the presidency. Let us create this new institution that's going to amalgamate the presidential employment stimulus. I spoke to also the head of the community works programs and understood the problems there, and also the expanded public works program and other agencies like the National Youth Service and Harambee. So let's build on something that seems to have worked during the pandemic, and let's create something tangible towards job creation. Because if you look back from 2020, the next election, 5 years, and we've created like 5 million work opportunities or 3 million full-time equivalent jobs. That is something tangible that people can talk about. But right now, I can't see anything tangible. Beyond that.
Absolutely. What about the expansion of welfare offerings? Because we did get the COVID grant as well. Of course, that's a few years back, but it's still going. The social safety net seems to, at least certainly, not have been rolled back, and I think that's something.
Yes. But I think what people need to understand is that the social relief of distress grant, it was 40 billion rand, and the budget has been going down each year. It wasn't funded; it just happened. But I do believe there will be an announcement in the State of the Nation address around the grants being adjusted for inflation. I was told, but then I said that is not enough. It has to be adjusted to the food poverty line, which is about 700 rand. I do think that I think the president wants to give the country, if he's listening, something tangible that they can go to this election with. And I think he must put his foot down against Mr. Godongwana, and he must say, listen here, this is my legacy. I need to do something tangible, because there's no time now. I think that something minimalistic like adjusting it for inflation, I don't think it will cut it. I think we need something more significant where it's moved towards the food poverty line. But we will see an announcement on that, I think,
Well, that's a great way to preview the next segment of this show. We're going to look at the future, what kind of proposals could be set forth to give hope to South Africans. Stick with us. We're previewing President Cyril Ramaphosa's all-important State of the Nation address on Thursday night. Welcome back to Unfiltered. On Thursday, President Cyril Ramaphosa will stand before the nation and give his assessment on its state. Are we moving in the right direction or the wrong direction? What needs to be done in the future to restore hope in South Africans' hearts? And this evening, we are analyzing, previewing that State of the Nation, looking at past promises, which ones have been kept, which ones have been broken. And Mr. Mahlangu, before we went to the break, you have delivered a systematic analysis of virtually every Sona promise last year, which has been very fun to watch and listen to. And I put a challenge to you and Mr. Qubule, who answered just before we went to the break, about what you think has gone right, because it is important to take a dispassionate view and reflect on what is going right, because things are going right as well in the country. What do you think is going right? We've reflected a lot on unemployment, load shedding, the battle to make a more capable state. What in your view is going well?
No, thanks. So I will start with what was already mentioned when it comes to the social relief of distress. So some of us still live in townships, and that has assisted a lot of people, and it still does. A lot of people's lives would be worse off. As much as it's 350, it's insignificant to a lot of people in the middle class, and they are affluent. But I can tell you, in those locations, that does go a long way. But it does need an exit strategy. And an exit strategy would be all the things we've mentioned earlier in terms of structural economic reforms and so forth, in order to ensure that people are economically active and can fend for themselves, and they do not necessarily rely fully or in part on the state. Also touched on the community work program. You see, when the community work program is supposed to establish what you call your local reference committees that must advise on the useful work and training. That is a good program on paper, but if it were to be implemented to the latter, it would not just be a stopgap program, because even the government itself does allude that it is an underemployment program just to give people some hours of work. But if it really did go as far as giving that actual training and also giving that useful work, a lot of those people would exit that program with skills that would enable them to be competitive in this economy. And I've seen some municipalities where it's being implemented, where the municipality would take the people on the program and they would give them useful skills in partnership with either universities of that province or that location or TVETs and so forth. So that is also quite good. And also, as much as it does have a lot of problems, but people are still able to now go to universities and study and become whatever they want to become, especially those that were on social grounds. Automatically they get fully funded. Those that live with disabilities come from quintile-wide schools and so forth. So that is quite commendable. And even what was presented by the Minister of Higher Education, I think last month or so, with regards to the new scheme, which is a model that was adopted from ISFAP. That is also quite good because it will assist even more people to gain entry into higher education, even though if we could argue about the capacity growth rate and so forth, that becomes a different conversation. But those are good things that are being proposed. Even the issue of NHI, even though I know that it has not been signed into law, but in principle, it is a good thing, even though it has serious issues that need to be resolved. But in principle, and if implemented right, I'm telling you, it would assist a lot of South Africans. So I may forget others, but
Sure.
as so much as we speak of the negatives, I trust and believe there are so many positives that we can speak about. So I say this deliberately because in many instances we come to these platforms and pretend as if the government is completely and utterly incompetent, useless, corrupt, and so forth. And it's not. That is why some of us are able to achieve our personal goals in this country, and we are able to live to our full potential in this very same country. But what we want is that it should be expanded to each and every citizen of this country. So there are some positives, and there are quite many.
Mr. Kubule, let's look at the future and the way forward and some of the things that in an ideal world the president could announce or could say. You know, what struck me about what you said earlier in the show is just some of our goals have become so narrow. You know, we no longer talk about long-term high growth, you know, in the 10%, you know, region for 10 years or full employment. We've become used to mediocre targets and mediocre outcomes often.
Yeah, I was listening to your show, the other one, and you're talking about South Africans have forgotten that they can be good times.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so now for us to start with the good times, there's a few things that we have to do quickly.
Sure.
Number one, we have to have a mobilizing vision and plan for this economy with a GDP growth target of 6% that is binding on National Treasury and the Reserve Bank. The central bank can't be independent of national goals. Number two, I want to see something on the basic income grant. They must increase it towards the food poverty line. Number three, we must announce a merger of all these job creation programs that are throughout government and set a tangible target in terms of public employment. Number four, we must invest in infrastructure for this country. We must NDP target of 30%. It's just a slogan. We must make it reality and 10% public investment. Number five, we must have this industrialization, this industrial policy. We must increase spending on industrial policy from this 0.3% of GDP to about 2.5%. And my hobby is this lack of financing for black SMMEs. We must do that as well. Number six, we must roll out universal public services, health, education, as he was talking about. And then we must have subsidized public electricity, mass housing and transport. I want to see this taxi industry repurposed, you know. And finally, and what really upsets me about South Africa right now is this waves of xenophobia. And we need to have a proper regional integration strategy. You know, Professor Sipamandla Zondi was saying to me one day, Duma, who benefits the most from accelerated regional integration? It's South Africa. Who suffers the most? It's South Africa when we don't integrate an economy. So at the end of the day, people get ahistoric about the situation on international migration. Under apartheid, there was a regional labor market integrated. And that is what Hugh Masekela was talking about in his song, Stimela. And people are forgetting about that, you know. And so what we need, international migration is about unbalanced economic development in our region. And we must sort out the situation in our region in terms of economic development, because there is no border that is, I mean, there's no security measures that are going to stop a migrant from Zimbabwe to come and join their family in South Africa. We have to sort out our regional economy. And you know, Caesar, I read the RDP again. And what the RDP had to say on international regional migration was amazing. And so I think we have to start seeing ourselves as part of a region. So that is what I would do as a country.
It's a very interesting set of proposals. Mr. Mahlangu, what do you think we can do going forward? What kind of promises would you like to hear about the future and new, fresh ideas that can take us into this future that we all so desire?
No, thanks. Over and above what has been mentioned, one would like to see stronger pathways, especially for young people. I mean, generally, there's planning for a person to go to early childhood development, go to primary, go to secondary, and then usually after secondary, problems start. And for some, after university or tertiary, problems start. So that tells you that there's no proper economic planning, there's no proper pathway management. And this is what was promised, even with the proposal of the Presidential Youth Employment Initiative. There was that pathway management structure within that initiative that was supposed to look into these things. I think also what was said, the fixed gross capital formation, it is quite important, because if you look into the infrastructure of this country, it's reaching its design life. And that is why even in certain areas, we are seeing even floodings, because that infrastructure has reached its design life and it can no longer cope. And there has not been any maintenance, expansion or rehabilitation over time. And that will take our country backwards. I mean, even when we talk about railway infrastructure, that is nearly gone. And we have seen even some mines closing down last year, talking about the environment of which they're operating in, that it's becoming more difficult now because there's no rail. But also, what is very key to me is that we can have all these initiatives, but if these initiatives are not being implemented, then we are back at one. So what is important is that this department, called the Department of DPME, Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, that department needs to be beefed up, because it is that department that must ensure that from national to provinces, and if possible at local government as well, each and everything that is there in policy, in planning documents, whether it's the NDP, whether maybe we don't want to use the NDP, we want to go back to RDP, ASGISA, GEAR, and so forth. Those are just ideas on paper. But if they do not form part and parcel of the planning processes of government across all spheres, and they are monitored and they are evaluated for impact, then nothing will move. So that department really needs to be strengthened. So all these initiatives, all these bold and nice ideas that we propose actually get implemented. Because if you look at it, some of these things are there in one piece of policy or the other, in one piece of planning document or the other. The other day I was reading the IDP of a municipality in the northwest called Moses Kotane. It is a municipality that its economy is driven by mining, agriculture, and tourism. Everything that one would have presented to them as a new idea is captured in that planning document, but it's not on the ground. It is not happening. So you ask yourself, where is the monitoring and evaluation in that municipality, from province, from national? So we really need to beef up the structures that must ensure that implementation takes place. And when we look into the Reserve Bank itself, the Reserve Bank, yes, I do agree, it has a significant role to play, but it's also important to remember that they do not have policy independence. So they will not set their own mandate and so forth, or their own policies and so forth. And that is the responsibility of cabinet. So it is cabinet that must actually be held accountable. But also, if you look into the ruling party and what they have agreed upon at their national conferences, all these things are articulated there from previous years. But they are also failing to ensure that their party policies find expression in government. And when they do at times ensure that there is that, then they do not ensure that there's adequate implementation. Right. So I can guarantee you now, you can go into, most especially provincial government and check, are they really aligning to the MSTF? Are they ensuring that those outcomes there actually materialize within the midterm? I can tell you it's not happening. So these good ideas are captured, but they're not implemented.
Well, Mr. Mahlangu and Mr. Qubule, I'd like to thank you very much for a fascinating take on South Africa's current state. This evening, we've looked at the state of the nation in view of President Cyril Ramaphosa's address on Thursday. Tyler won a Grammy. The Springboks won the World Cup. Bafana's in the semi-final of AFCON. But it's time for the nation to have some economic and governance victories too. And that's what the nation will be hoping for into the future. President Cyril Ramaphosa will be delivering his State of the Nation address to inspire hope. Let's see if he can deliver that on Thursday. Thanks for watching the show, and we'll see you for the next installment of Unfiltered.